September 26, 1983. Just past midnight, Moscow. 5 alarms. 5 American missiles. Incoming. Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov stared at the screen. The protocol said he had only minutes, maybe 4, to report what he was seeing. If Moscow believed it, the chain would move fast. Trust the system, make the call, and start World War III. Or trust what he knew, do nothing, and pray the machines were wrong. One man, one choice. The entire world in the balance. This is the story of the night that almost ended everything. But to understand what happened in that bunker, we have to go back. September 1983. The Cold War wasn't cold anymore. It was boiling. 3 weeks earlier, on September 1st, Soviet fighters had intercepted and shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007 after it strayed into restricted Soviet airspace. 269 passengers and crew were dead. Among them, a sitting U.S. congressman. The world exploded in outrage. President Reagan called it an act of barbarism. The Soviet response was defiant. The plane was a spy mission, a provocation, and they had every right to defend their territory. But the truth was Messier. The Korean airliner had drifted off course due to a navigation error. Soviet pilots had tried to intercept, but communication failed. In the darkness, under pressure, with Cold War paranoia at full volume, a catastrophic mistake became inevitable, and it poisoned everything. NATO activity intensified. Military exercises near Soviet borders, tests, drills, movements. To the West, it was routine pressure, a reminder of strength. To Moscow, it looked different. It looked like preparation, like the kind of noise you make right before you strike. Soviet intelligence reported NATO nuclear forces at heightened readiness. Leadership in the Kremlin aging, paranoid, sick genuinely. Believed the West might attempt a decapitation strike. Hit Moscow, hit command centers. Eliminate Soviet leadership before they could respond. In that climate, the Soviet early warning system wasn't just a tool. It was a lifeline. The only way to detect an American first strike in time to retaliate. The system was called OKO. In Russian, it means eye. A constellation of satellites in high orbit, scanning the continental United States. Watching for one thing, the heat signature of an ICBM launch. The bright, unmistakable bloom of fire rising through the atmosphere. If OKO saw fire, it would scream, and the chain of command would move. On September 26, 1983, at 12:14 a.m. Moscow time, OKO screamed. Stanislav Petrov wasn't supposed to be there that night. He was 44 years old. A quiet man. A systems engineer by training, not a soldier chosen for bravery or political loyalty. He'd spent years working on early warning technology. He understood how satellites worked, how sensors interpreted data, how systems could be designed brilliantly and still fail in unexpected ways. He wasn't a hawk. He wasn't a dove. He was a technician who understood that technology, no matter how sophisticated, had limits. And on September 26th, he was covering a shift for a colleague who was out sick. Just filling in. Nothing special. No reason to expect anything but another quiet night monitoring screens in a bunker where nothing ever happened. The bunker was designated Serpukhov 15, about 100 miles south of Moscow. An underground fortress of reinforced concrete, rows of screens glowing in the dark, banks of computers humming. The air was stale cigarette smoke, mixed with the sharp metallic smell of overheated electronics. Was the nerve center of the Soviet early warning system, the place where satellite data arrived first. where human eyes made the first judgment, where the first decision would be made. Petrov's role was straightforward. Watch the screens. If Oko detected a launch, report it to Soviet military command. They would verify, assess, and decide. He wasn't the one who would order a counterattack, but he was the first link in the chain. And once that chain started moving, it moved fast. Protocol said, if you see evidence of an incoming strike, report it immediately. Don't delay. Don't second guess. The survival of the Soviet Union depends on speed. Petrov knew the protocol. He'd trained for it. He'd run through scenarios, but he'd never expected the alarm to be real. And when it sounded, he had seconds to decide whether it was at 12:14 a.m. The alarm sounded. It wasn't subtle. A loud, piercing electronic wail. The kind of sound designed to cut through sleep, through distraction, through disbelief. The main screen lit up. Red, flashing. A single word in Russian. Launch. One missile. Detected. Incoming from the United States. Petrov felt his body react before his mind could catch up. His hand drifted toward the phone on his desk. The red phone. The one with a direct line to Soviet military command. His heart was pounding. His throat was dry. And then a thought cut through the adrenaline. One missile? If the Americans were launching a first strike, a real, calculated attack designed to disable the Soviet Union before it could retaliate, they wouldn't send one missile. They'd send hundreds, maybe thousands. Overwhelming force. Hit every command center, every missile silo, every airfield, all at once. Leave nothing standing. One missile didn't make strategic sense. It felt like a mistake, or a malfunction, or something worse, a decoy, meant to provoke a Soviet launch that the world would see as unprovoked aggression. Petrov hesitated, and then, 40 seconds later, the alarm sounded again. The screen updated. 2 missiles, then 3, then 4. Then 5. 5 American ICBMs, all showing infrared signatures consistent with launch, all heading in trajectories that suggested Soviet targets. The other officers in the room froze, eyes locked on Petrov. Waiting. One of them spoke, voice tight. Sir, protocol requires. I know what protocol requires, Petrov said. His voice was calmer than it should have been, calmer than he felt. 5 missiles, still not hundreds. Still not the overwhelming barrage you'd expect from a real first strike, but 5 was enough to be terrifying. Enough to make you doubt. Red phone sat in front of him. 1 call, 1 sentence. Launch detected. 5 missiles inbound. And the chain would start. Moscow would scramble to assess. They'd wake the premier. They'd activate launch protocols. And under the pressure of minutes, maybe less, they'd likely launch back. Petrov's hand hovered over the phone, and he thought, what if the system is wrong? Here's what most people misunderstand about that night. The story is usually told like this. Stanislav Petrov was a hero with perfect intuition. He trusted his gut over technology, defied direct orders, and single-handedly saved the world from nuclear war. That version makes for a good story, but it's not quite accurate. First, Petrov didn't defy orders. Soviet protocol required him to. Report detections, yes, but it didn't explicitly order him to report detections as confirmed without question. There was ambiguity, room for judgment. The system assumed the human operator would assess credibility. Second, Petrov didn't rely on gut instinct. He relied on something colder, something more calculated. His knowledge of the system, because Petrov knew something about Oko, something that many decision-makers in the Soviet military and political leadership didn't fully understand or hadn't internalized. Oko wasn't perfect. It had a flaw, and that flaw could kill millions. Oko's satellites weren't watching America like a camera watches a room. They weren't taking pictures. They were hunting for heat. Specifically, they were scanning for infrared radiation patterns of heat that matched the signature of a rocket engine burning through the atmosphere. A missile launch is hot, blindingly hot. The exhaust plume of an ICBM climbing out of a silo produces a heat bloom visible from space. Oko's sensors were tuned to detect that bloom. When they saw it, they'd flag it. The system would calculate trajectory, estimate target, and send an alert. That's how Oko worked, and on paper, it was brilliant. But here's the problem. Oko's sensors couldn't distinguish between a missile's heat signature and certain natural phenomena that produced similar infrared patterns. Specifically, sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds under very specific conditions when the sun was at a low angle relative to the satellite's position, and when certain types of clouds were present over the United States, the reflection could create a bright infrared signature, one that looked almost identical to a missile plume. A false fire in the sky. Soviet engineers knew about this risk. Technical memos had been written. Reports had been filed. The flaw wasn't secret. It was documented, but fixing it would require shutting down Oko for maintenance, upgrading sensors, recalibrating algorithms, and in the paranoid atmosphere of 1983, turning off the early warning system, even temporarily, felt more dangerous than leaving a flawed system running. So they kept it online. And on the night of September 26th, the conditions were perfect for the flaw to trigger. Petrov had read those technical reports. He knew the system could be fooled by reflections. He knew that false alarms were possible, not common, but possible. And 5 missiles, not 50, not 500, felt like a pattern error, like a ghost, like the system seeing something that wasn't there, but he couldn't be certain. He had minutes, maybe less, a phone, a choice, and no way to prove he was right until it was too late to matter. Petrov stared at the screen. The alarms kept screaming. The officers around him were tense, waiting for him to act. He imagined 2 futures in one. The missiles were real. American ICBMs climbing toward Soviet airspace. If he didn't report it, if he dismissed it as a malfunction, cities would burn. Millions would die. And historians would write that the Soviet Union fell because one man hesitated in the other. The missiles were ghosts, reflections, errors, and if he reported them as confirmed, if Moscow believed him, Soviet missiles would launch in retaliation. America would detect them. NATO would respond. And within 30 minutes, tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions, would be dead, all because of a false alarm. The red phone sat on his desk, heavy, simple, final. Petrov forced his voice to stay steady. "I'm reporting a system malfunction," he said. One of the officers beside him stiffened. "Sir, the system clearly shows." "I know what it shows," Petrov interrupted. His tone was firm. "And I'm reporting it as a probable malfunction. We wait for ground radar confirmation." The officer looked like he wanted to argue, but Petrov outranked him. And the decision for now was Petrov's. Petrov picked up the red phone. He did call Moscow, but he didn't say 5 American missiles. Confirmed. Launch detected. He said, possible system error. 5 signals detected by satellite. No ground radar confirmation yet. Investigating. It was the truth, but it was framed in a way that bought time. What we know for certain from later interviews and accounts is that Petrov chose not to treat the satellite alert as a confirmed American attack. He waited for independent verification from ground-based radar, and that decision changed everything. Now the clock mattered in a different way. If the missiles were real, if 5 American ICBMs were truly climbing through the atmosphere toward Soviet territory, then ground-based radar stations would detect them as they rose over the horizon. Radar worked differently than satellites. It bounced radio waves off physical objects. If there were missiles, radar would see them. Solid, unambiguous. Proof. If the radar confirmed the satellite data, this would become irreversible. The Soviet leadership would have no choice but to launch. So Petrov waited. The satellite system kept screaming. 5 missiles. 5 infrared signatures. Inbound. But the ground radar stayed silent. 1 minute passed. Then 2. Then 3. Nothing. No radar contacts. No missiles climbing over the horizon. No confirmation. 5 minutes. 6. 7. Still nothing. The officers in the room began to shift uncomfortably. If missiles had been launched, they should have appeared on radar by now. The trajectory didn't make sense. 8 minutes. 9. 10. At the point where impact would have been minutes. Away where Soviet cities would have been bracing for detonation. The radar screens were still empty. Petrov allowed himself a slow breath. His hands were shaking, not from fear, though he'd been afraid, but from the adrenaline draining out of the system. The way your hands shake after you stop a car inches from a collision. The system had seen something. But it wasn't missiles. It was ghosts. Early warning systems are built on a principle. Redundancy. Satellites detect. Radar confirms. The idea is simple. If both systems agree, you can trust the data. If they don't, you investigate. That layered verification is supposed to be the safety net, the thing that prevents a false alarm from starting a war. But here's what makes Petrov's decision so terrifying. If he had reported the satellite alert as a confirmed American strike, if he'd framed it with certainty instead of caution Soviet, leadership might not have waited for radar confirmation. They might have launched immediately. Because in the logic of nuclear deterrence, speed matters. If you wait too long to respond to a first strike, your missiles might be destroyed in their silos. You lose the ability to retaliate. You lose deterrence. Launch on warning. Don't wait for impact. That was the doctrine. Petrov's choice to frame the alert as uncertain as a possible malfunction gave the system time to breathe. Time for radar to stay silent. Time for cooler heads to realize nothing was coming. But if he'd been more certain? If he'd trusted the satellite data without question, we might not be here. So what actually happened? An investigation was launched weeks later, after the incident had been quietly documented and filed away. The conclusion: OCO's satellite sensors had detected sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds over the United States. The angle of the sun, the position of the satellite, and the specific atmospheric conditions created an infrared pattern that the system interpreted as 5 missile launches. The system didn't malfunction. It did exactly what it was designed to do: detect infrared signatures and flag them as potential launches. It just misread reality. And there's a deeper, more troubling reason the flaw was never fixed. The Cold War didn't allow for downtime. Both superpowers were locked in a constant state of readiness. Turning off your early warning system, even to upgrade it, even to fix a known flaw, felt like closing your eyes in the middle of a knife fight. Better to keep a flawed eye open than to go blind. Even temporarily. So OCO stayed online. Flawed, dangerous, watching. Until the night it almost ended the world. Later, investigations, declassified documents, and interviews with engineers confirmed the cause. Sunlight, clouds, and a sensor design. That couldn't tell the difference. That supports the explanation. It tells us what the system saw and why it was wrong, but it doesn't tell us every detail of what Petrov personally knew in that exact moment. We don't have a recording of his thoughts. We don't know if he'd read that specific technical memo the week before, or if his knowledge was general, accumulated over years of working with the system. What we know is this: he understood the flaw was possible. He knew 5 missiles didn't match the profile of a real American first strike. And he made a choice based on that understanding, not instinct, knowledge. And it saved us. You'd think Stanislav Petrov would have been celebrated, promoted, decorated, honored as the man who prevented World War III. He wasn't. He was reprimanded. Not publicly, not harshly, but his career stalled. He was transferred to a less critical post, and the incident was quietly buried in Soviet military records. Why? Because the story was embarrassing. It exposed a critical vulnerability in the Soviet early warning system. It revealed that Oko, the technological eye that was supposed to protect the Soviet Union, could be fooled by sunlight and clouds. That kind of weakness couldn't be advertised. Not in the middle of the Cold War. Not when the entire doctrine of deterrence depended on the appearance of infallibility. So the story was classified. Petrov was told to keep quiet, and the world moved on, unaware of how close it had come. For 16 years, almost no one outside the Soviet military knew what had happened on September 26, 1983. The story didn't surface until 1998, when a retired Soviet colonel mentioned Petrov's name in an interview. Journalists started asking questions. Slowly, the details emerged. By then, the Soviet Union had collapsed. The Cold War was over, and Petrov was living in a small apartment outside Moscow. Retired, largely forgotten, struggling financially. In 2004, he was invited to the United States and honored by the Association of World Citizens. In 2006, the United Nations gave him an award. Western media called him the man who saved the world. But Petrov was uncomfortable with the title. In interviews, he downplayed his role. He insisted he was just doing his job, following protocol, making a judgment call. "I didn't want to be responsible for starting a war," he said. "That's all." Stanislav Petrov died on May 19, 2017. He was 77 years old. His death went unnoticed for months. No headlines, no obituaries. It wasn't until September, 4 months later, that the world learned he was gone. The man who saved billions of lives died quietly, alone, largely forgotten. 3 lessons. First, trust systems, but only if you understand their limits. OKO was built by some of the best engineers in the Soviet Union. It was sophisticated, expensive, and most of the time it worked, but it had a flaw, a blind spot, and that flaw could be catastrophic. Petrov didn't save the world because he ignored technology. He saved it because he understood the technology. He knew where it could break. He knew the conditions under which it could be fooled. In our lives, we rely on systems every day. Algorithms that recommend what we watch, what we buy, who we talk to. Protocols that tell us how to respond in emergencies. Experts who tell us what's true. Most of the time, those systems work. But blind trust is dangerous. Know the limits. Ask the questions. Understand the mechanism behind the recommendation, the diagnosis, the alert, because the stakes might be higher than you think. Second, fear doesn't make you cautious. It makes you reactive. September 1983 was a moment of maximum Cold War paranoia. A passenger plane had been shot down. NATO exercises were ramping up. Soviet leadership genuinely believed the West might strike first. In that climate of fear, a false alarm could easily have been believed, could easily have triggered a response. Fear doesn't slow us down. It speeds us up. It makes us see threats everywhere. It makes us react before we think. And reaction without thought is how disasters happen. Petrov had minutes, maybe 4, to make a decision. In that moment, under crushing pressure, he forced himself to stop, to think, to question. When the stakes are highest and the fear is loudest, that's when we need to slow down the most. Not freeze, not panic, just pause, verify, ask, what if I'm wrong? Because the cost of being wrong might be everything. Third, the people who prevent disasters are rarely celebrated. We remember the heroes who act, the soldiers who charge, the firefighters who run into burning buildings, the doctors who save lives. With bold interventions, we forget the people who prevent disasters by choosing not to act, the person who stops the car before the collision, the person who refuses to escalate the argument, the person who doesn't pull the trigger. Petrov's heroism wasn't action. It was restraint. He didn't launch a counterattack. He didn't sound the alarm with certainty. He didn't let fear override judgment. He waited. He questioned. He refused to turn uncertainty into catastrophe. And that kind of heroism doesn't get parades. It doesn't get monuments. Most of the time, it doesn't even get remembered because nothing happened. No explosion. No death toll. No visible disaster to point to. We only remember it decades later when someone asks, wait, why didn't World War III happen that night? And the answer is, someone chose not to start it. Stanislav Petrov understood the danger of treating a machine's warning as unquestionable truth. But he wasn't the only one. There was another moment, another crisis. This time, deep under the ocean, during the Cuban Missile Crisis. A Soviet submarine, surrounded by American warships, carrying a nuclear-tipped torpedo. 3 officers in a steel tube. 1 vote away from launching. 2 wanted to fire. 1 man said no. His name was Vasily Arkhipov, and his decision was even more impossible than Petrov's. That file is next. That's the story history tried to hide. I'll see you in the next file.